how do you deal with the fact that the spirit does not always, its winds are not always pushing in a linear direction?
How do I personally deal with it? It depends on the day.
Sure.
But I think I affirm the statement. I think theologically that
Mm,
is true. There was a great article in the gosh, I think it was the early '90s or maybe late '80s, by the amazing theologian Sister Elizabeth Johnson, and she talks about how the Holy Spirit. Basically, the theological article was about chance. Like, what is the relationship between divine providence and chance, right? Seen oftentimes as oppositional, right? Either God has an absolute plan, and if that's true, then God's plan for some people is pretty crappy. Sorry to use that
mm,
language, but
hmm.
right. And so, theology, spirituality studies, practices, and spiritual traditions have made clear, I think, for a long time that reduction to a quote God's plan or a kind of strong providentialism can be really problematic. God does not desire the suffering of others. So when we see tragedy or violence happen, we can't say that it's God's plan. That's absurd, right? Yet on the other hand, we do believe that God is not absent from the world, and so not everything can be random chance. And one of the things Professor Johnson does is say, well, the Holy Spirit accounts for this, right? The Holy Spirit is this dynamic presence of God in the world. And so the way that the spirit moves, the way that history unfolds is rarely linear. Insofar that it ever is recognizably linear, it's always post factum, right? It's always turning back over our shoulders to say, oh my gosh, I grew up in this place of this faith tradition. I studied this sort of thing in college. I found myself interested in this. I wrote that. Next thing I know, I'm an editor at Franciscan Media and I'm Stephen Copeland, right? So like, but you couldn't have anticipated that, right? You couldn't have plotted that out. I think that's a lesson in humility for each of us, right? Like the danger on the one hand of saying God has a plan, is magnified, I think, on the other hand, by claiming that our plans are God's plans. And we can get really frustrated when they don't come to fruition or don't play out the way we want them to. And then we're not really even talking about divine providence. We're talking about our own sort of acting as God. Like I should have things the way I want it to be. But I think if we open ourselves up to the truth that the Spirit moves through the world, I'm thinking again, Francis of Assisi said that the real minister general, the kind of the greatest superior, the kind of where the buck stops in the order of Friars Minor is the Holy Spirit. And anybody, I'm sure we have a lot of professed and Franciscan hearted people listening to us. You know the Franciscan tradition, and we are kind of a hot mess of a community. I always make a distinction between the Franciscans and the Jesuits. Ignatius was a soldier through and through. He says jump, they don't even ask how high, they just start doing it. That's the vision. The Franciscans, the joke always goes that it's like herding cats, kind of all over the place. But I think there's something too about the dynamism of the Spirit at work. And when we say the Spirit is the minister general of the order, do we believe that? I wrote a number of short articles in my column some years ago about the Holy Spirit and how I really do believe that most Christians are functional Holy Spirit atheists. We forget about the Spirit. It's too uncomfortable to think about dynamism of the uncertain of what might be perceived as chance, right, as opposed to what you said, right, that linear sort of divine plan. So I don't know. There's something very liberating potentially about embracing that and recognizing God is present here too.